Hello, and welcome to this Institute for Government Fringe event, Global Britain, What's the Plan? My name's Hannah White. I'm the Deputy Director of the Institute for Government. Today, we're going to be exploring all the key questions about how the government should approach the concept of Global Britain. And we're really delighted to have the support today of Imperial College London and the Wellcome Trust to bring this event to you. So, now the UK has left the EU, it has an opportunity to redefine its role in the world. But how should this opportunity be used? What kind of trading nation should the UK aspire to be? How should the government be thinking about the UK's international reputation and its priorities outside the EU? In what areas should the UK seek to build coalitions with like-minded countries? And are there opportunities for the UK to become a global leader in any particular areas? Lots of questions, and we have a fantastic panel with us to answer them. We hope, very shortly, the Right Honourable Greg Hands MP, who is Minister of State for Trade Policy in the Department for International Trade, and he's been MP for Hammersmith and Fulham and then Chelsea and Fulham since 2005. We have Stephen Adams, who is a Senior Director of Global Counsel, and he has almost 20 years of experience in European and British public policy and regulation, chiefly in the field of trade policy, cross-border financial services policy, and European integration. Professor Ian Walmsley became the second Provost of Imperial College London in September 2018, and he's also Chair in Experimental Physics at the college. Before joining Imperial, Professor Walmsley served as Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation and Hook Professor of Experimental Physics at the University of Oxford. Georgina Wright is a Senior Researcher on the Brexit team at the Institute for Government, where she focuses on UK engagement and influence in the EU after Brexit. Prior to joining the Institute, she was a research associate at Chatham House and has worked for the European Commission and NATO in Brussels. So a few housekeeping points before we begin. A reminder that this event is being held on the record. The IFG will make a video and audio podcast of it available on our website as soon as possible after we finish today. And our staff will be live tweeting throughout the event from IFG events, that's our Twitter handle. And if you would like to tweet and to reference the event, then the hashtag to use is IFGCPC20. I'd like to put your panels to your questions to the panel as well as my own. So please do start submitting them as soon as you want using the Q&A function that you can see on the screen. And if you would like to, please let us know where you're joining us from around the country. And for those of you who are viewing the conference in our virtual tent, if you would like to know more about our work in this area, then please click on the Get in Touch button to submit your details, and then we can send you more information. So let's get started. I have some questions I'd like to put to the panel, but as I said, please do submit your questions too. I'm not sure whether Greg Hands has joined us yet. So I think I'll kick off with you, Steve.
I hope you can hear me.
Oh, there he is. He is there. Great.
Okay. Sorry, I had a technical problem. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you very well.
Fantastic. Excellent.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us, Minister. Could you kick us off with a answer to a very general question? How should the UK be approaching its trade deals in terms of its wider foreign policy priorities?
Yeah, well, I think the read across is pretty clear. You know, you can see from the first round of negotiations we're doing, notwithstanding the EU negotiation, the negotiations for which I and Liz Truss are responsible are with the United States, Japan, Australia and New Zealand. So we're, if you like, kicking off with free trade, free market oriented allies around the world. And then we are looking as part of our overall Indo-Pacific tilt, looking at joining the CPTPP trading group, the Pacific Rim trading group, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. And then beyond that, we'll be looking at our trade negotiations with the likes of India, with the Gulf, with Mercosur and so on. So in that sense, trade is a vital, in many ways, the most important part of the overall Global Britain agenda.
Foreign policy priorities that the UK used to pursue as part of the EU. What do you think are the differences now that we've left? What will we be able to do differently as a result in terms of foreign policy?
Well, I think on trade deals, being outside of the EU enables us to go further in areas where it's more purely in the UK national interest. Rather, having spent 2 years at EU trade FAC meetings, trade council meetings, inevitably EU trade policy is always seeking to get the lowest common denominator. And 28 countries will often have different, sometimes conflicting trade interests. So I think the UK's ability to run our own trade policy means we can go further in areas that suit the UK. And that's exactly what we've just done in the UK-Japan deal, for example. We've gone further on areas like data, on areas like financial services, on the movement of professional people. We've taken that further with Japan than the EU did before. So it's taking advantage of those opportunities that we would have of having our own independent trade policy now, and also leveraging off our what I would say is our global soft power, leveraging off our global diplomatic network. The fact that we are spending 0.7% of national income on international development, I think, facilitates our trade agenda. As does the fact that we, are a significant player around the world, whether it be at the one of the 5 members of the Security Council, the Five Eyes relationship. We've got the Commonwealth. All of these are really, really important aspects of UK influence abroad that obviously we bring to bear in our trade relationship too.
Stephen, can I move to you now? Just bearing in mind the sorts of ambitions that the ministers set out there, what do you think are the key global trends the UK will need to be prepared to navigate from outside the EU?
Well, it's certainly the case that the UK has chosen an interesting moment to adopt a fully autonomous trade policy, in the sense that we find ourselves in a period of intense flux in terms of the global management of international trade. The WTO system has probably never experienced a period of strain like the one it's currently experienced. And I think, it's obvious to all of us that this is a time of very serious geopolitical tension. So that in itself is a challenge. We are staking out our stall and setting out an agenda for leadership in a world where leadership has arguably never been more difficult. And that means that the UK is going to have to be very smart about how it goes about trying to shape the work of the WTO or similar organizations or similar arrangements like the Basel system or the ISO or any of the standard setting bodies that ultimately create the parameters in which international trade happens. I think the point about soft power is clearly an important one, and I think that if anything, the biggest challenge for the UK is to work out what global Britain means beyond the signing of free trade agreements. And if we think about free trade agreements as deals, the 4 years since the referendum has really been very heavily focused on the kinds of deals we can strike. And I think that the next iteration of global Britain is going to need to be about the bridges, if you like. If deals get negotiated, bridges get built. And the real, it seems to me, in fact, the real opportunity for the UK in the post-Brexit period is to think about the ways in which it can engage with international debates on the shaping of standards around frontier technology, whether that's things like AI or internet governance. There's clearly a huge shift in the way we use technology to supply and ultimately to trade services. One of the big lessons of the last 6 months, as many of us, those of us who have been fortunate enough to do so, have moved over into working remotely, has been that the potential, in fact, to now create global supply chains in services delivered remotely over the internet is enormous, and that's going to change the way we think about what a services supply chain is. And it's a big opportunity for the UK in many respects, but it's one that's going to need very careful thinking, and we're going to need to reflect that in the way we approach not just our free trade agreements, but our regulatory diplomacy, our attempts to try and shape the way in which frameworks for cross-border services delivery evolve over the years ahead.
And what do you think about the sort of bigger geopolitical sort of shifts and battles that are going on at the moment, and how the UK can sort of best position itself between these, China, the US, the position of the EU? What's what are going to be the challenges there?
Well, part of the challenge, of course, is just being outside of the room. If the room is the place where the US and China, and the China and the EU and the EU and the US ultimately resolve their differences, if they are able to. But the reality is that there is nevertheless a role for the UK to play in a world in which those three actors are debating the evolution of the international trade regime. The reality is that there's always a market for good ideas in Geneva, and that's not really a question of size. Actually, it's often a question much more of who can insert intelligent ideas into the debate at the right time. And my instinct would be that that's the sort of thing that actually the UK can do very well. It's not an easy thing to do, but there must be a sense in which the UK can potentially be a form of safe harbour in a world in which we have rising trade and geopolitical tensions between the three big actors in the global economy. There must be a way in which it can use its own free trade agreements and its own unilateral liberalization as a way of essentially creating corridors for supply chains that sidestep or work around some of the big tensions in the system. So I don't think it's easy, but I think actually that the prospect of carving out a role as an actor outside of those three big blocks, but able nevertheless to play an influential role is quite an interesting one for the UK to be stepping into.
Professor Walmsley, Stephen was talking there about some of the sort of the strengths of the UK being, providing some of the good ideas and managing to sort of put those in at the right moment. What are the strengths that you can see that you think the UK ought to be drawing on when it's sort of defining its new place in the world?
Yeah, it's an important question. I think if one thinks about the ways in which ideas are generated, then the sort of knowledge ecosystem that the UK supports and is part of globally are going to be an important part of that. So the strengths in our research domain clearly have already got very strong global connections, and will need to grow and sustain those. And those will need to be married to a really vibrant innovation system, which can take the most influential ideas that are currently available for application and drive forward the societal benefits that can accrue from those. And I think that the UK is therefore well positioned. We have a research and higher education sector that is globally recognized, that can both attract the best minds to the UK and also send out some of the best ideas to address some of the current global challenges. So I think that the notion that Greg posited about the ways in which we influence the world can also be driven through the knowledge base that we generate here and apply.
And how can government go about best supporting that system?
Well, I think some of the ways in which the government is already acting, I think, do very well. The growth to 2.4% of GDP to support research and development is most welcome. That will put us on a trajectory that really matches those of our major international competitors and collaborators. I think that's really important. The second is to make sure that the UK is friendly to global collaborations, and again, things like the visa circumstance that the global talent visas are really important in that respect. I think as the situation changes around the world, in China and the US, perhaps especially, a place which is seen to be a welcoming to global talent and provide a place where people can take risks in new discovery and new application, I think are going to be really valuable.
Thanks very much. Georgie, you've done a lot of thinking about the way that the UK government best work within the EU to now that we've left, still make the most of the opportunities that that there are, and the way it can go about that. What do you think, within the EU and more broadly, is the best way for the UK government to approach this now?
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent question. It's also quite nice to come last because it means that some of the great sort of suggestions have already been raised. But I mean, first is kind of acknowledge what the UK already has in terms of like influence and what it's able to accomplish on the global stage. So obviously it has a hugely extensive diplomatic footprint. It's well known for its thought leadership, so that's across areas, from security to development to research, and obviously, issues like climate change and corruption. On all of these issues, the UK has something to say and is recognised for it. Obviously, the government has lots of capabilities, obviously a big aid budget, but also, known for kind of spending a lot on research, cultivating that. Defence, all of those things, and then is incredibly influential also in international organisations. Obviously, its permanent seat in the UN Security Council, but also in NATO. But I think there are some dangers, and those are the dangers we looked into in the report, is that one, the UK becomes a bit complacent in the sense that it thinks, well, we are quite influential on the global stage, so we'll just carry on as is. As has been raised before, Minister and the other panelists, is that the world is changing, and so the government really needs to get its messaging right. So we know that the integrated review promises a vision of global Britain that will deliver for the British people. But I also think the government needs to think very carefully about the messaging on how it conveys its messages abroad. So, how are you going to get other countries to listen to your great ideas? So obviously one is having a great idea, but it's also the way that you present that great idea and where you're active, what, forums and organisations you prioritise to promote and deliver on those ideas. And then finally, maybe a more IFG take on this is really getting the sort of coordination across government right. So, when you're thinking about global Britain, it's obviously not just the FCDO or the Department for International Trade, it's also very much the centre of government and across government departments. So really making sure that ministers know what the government's priorities are and are able to deliver that. And then, of course, in our British embassies and high commissions abroad, that they are also in tune with what's going on.
Thanks, Georgie. Greg, can I come back to you now? I'm starting to draw on some of the questions we're getting through from the audience, which are really interesting. And the one from Shankar that says, what's our USP when it comes to building a global Britain? What is it now that the government's really wanting to sort of put forward as the country's unique selling points?
I would say our values of free trade, free markets, liberal politics, democracy. I would say, broadly speaking, our values, which we should be very proud of and have been very successful for us for at least the last 70 years. And secondly, I would say connectivity and making sure that we remain, we're an incredibly connected country, both physically and metaphorically. In terms of our alliances and partnerships all the way around the world across a huge multitude of different topic areas. I think in many senses we are unique in our sort of connectivity across centres. So I would say, broadly speaking, those two things, and using our connectivity to help promote our values, which we know are values which are not selfish values. I mean, they've served Britain very well, but we know that they're values that increase and improve prosperity and peace around the world, trade interaction, democracy. We know that those are things that have been very successful for us and for other countries. So I would say working those two things together and facing down challenges, wherever they may come from, of people who question some of those things. Okay, we won't always be able to face down everybody at the same time. But I think we should be confident of our values and confident to say to others when they're doing things or saying things that don't meet our values.
And do you think, just to think about our very current circumstances, do you think there are instances where that's going to be arising for us in relation to coronavirus and the sort of global coordination challenges which are going to come when, hopefully we get a vaccine? And wanting to think about how to project our values as well as do the best thing for the UK.
Well, I think that's right. And actually what we've seen with the virus has been challenges sometimes thrown up from unlikely places in relation to trade. Liz Truss, our Secretary of State, has been absolutely on the front foot, for example, at the G20 trade ministers all the way back in April, I think it was, arguing against new trade restrictions put up in the name of the virus. And those might have been restrictions on PPE, on medicines, often from some of our most like-minded partners, and making sure that the UK is true to our values during the pandemic crisis, which is there may be some role for onshoring in places, or making sure at least that you have the capability to be able to produce some of these vital goods that you need for combating the crisis. But in general, the solution for us and for everybody else around the world is trade diversification. We need more trade, not less trade, in a lot of these areas. So I think the virus has actually brought a lot of our existing agenda more into focus, actually, and particularly in terms of free trade and international cooperation.
And a linked question we have has come in from Nick Reed, who asks, to what extent is the life science sector a priority within the UK's current trade talks?
Yeah, it was a huge priority. We are an absolute global leader in life sciences. We've got some of the best life sciences clusters anywhere in the world. I know Imperial College, from hearing from Ian earlier, London is a huge centre for us, Cambridge, Oxford, Edinburgh, Cardiff, other parts of the UK, very, very important, and doing whatever we can to facilitate life sciences exchanges, whether they be removing regulatory barriers, mutual recognition of each other's systems, making sure that professional people can move around the world in the life sciences sector, absolutely vital. For example, on the investment side, the UK has to continue to remain a very attractive place for people to invest in life sciences. So life sciences is, in short, a very important part of our trade agenda.
I don't know if you want to come in there, Ian. Does that capture the sorts of priorities there are from Imperial's point of view in terms of the life science sector?
Yes, absolutely. I think what one has seen during COVID is the ability of a research and innovation base across UK institutions to really step up to the challenges across the board, both in forming policy and in developing things like vaccines. And I think the strong investments that the UK has made in that have given it an important base on which it can rapidly spring into action and be very influential. Connections across the world are absolutely vital in that, and both bilateral and multilateral networks will continue to be really important. But I think the UK is well positioned to continue that primacy in life sciences.
Can I just go back to a question that Georgie raised, which was right at the end of her remarks, and this is a question now from Beth Thompson of Wellcome to the Minister again. Georgie was talking about how important it is not just to have good ideas, but to think about how you talk about those ideas. And what do you think the priorities should be in terms of how the government goes about presenting its ideas about the sort of the concept of global Britain, or its research priorities, or its the things it's trying to achieve its international engagement?
Thank you. I think the answer, if I understood the question, I may not have got the complete subtlety in the question, but I think the answer, it goes back to what George was saying about complacency. In the UK, the easiest thing to be would be to say, look, we're at the centre of everything. We're a member of every global organisation there is going, and we have fantastic, innovative businesses and a very discerning consumer base. Therefore, everything's fine. And we cannot, for any moment, be complacent. And being able to engage UK ideas, moving forward across a whole wide variety of agenda items. Next year at COP26, on climate change, on trade, through independent membership of the World Trade Organization. I'm really looking forward to us taking key parts of the UK trade agenda and seeing whether we can be the leaders at the WTO in terms of things like trade and services, which has been stalled at the World Trade Organization, and on the development side, A, leading by example, but B, making sure that our development agenda moves into the next phase, which is really to raise prosperity in developing countries. That is, I see all of these areas as being absolutely vital for the UK, and we mustn't be complacent for one moment. Just because we're well situated today, we need to make sure that we fight to maintain that position, and also make sure that others remain open to our agenda.
I think that's a really interesting point, and at the Institute we were facilitating some roundtables that Wellcome were running recently, where we were looking at exactly this question of how the UK can facilitate networks across developing countries to enable them, for it not to just be a binary relationship between the UK and those countries, but in order to promote effective research. And as you say, increase the prosperity of those countries, how we can be a facilitator of networks across the global south.
Absolutely. And again, it's leveraging off our diplomatic network. I think, by the way, there's an awful lot that we can learn from others as well. I think one of the things that governance in general in the UK has not been so strong on, really, ever since I've been involved in politics, the last 20 years, has been learning from what other countries are doing in this space. So I don't think we study, for example, enough of what other Western countries are doing in their approaches to these problems. It's something picking up. In fact, it was just the weekend I was reading the German government's latest document in terms of their development agenda. Actually, that's a really interesting thing, sort of seeing, okay, you see huge areas of common approach, but some of those differences, you can always innovate. And government, we need to be more innovative, particularly learning from international examples.
Stephen, can I come back to you and just put the previous question that I put to the Minister, which was about what you think the priorities should be for the government in terms of how it talks about its ideas, how it presents itself now on the global stage?
Yeah, well, I would make two observations. One is it's clearly right that the UK needs to focus on how it communicates externally, in part because one of the effects of having an autonomous trade policy is that we'll be speaking for ourselves in a way that we weren't necessarily or haven't necessarily been doing for the past 3 decades. And partly that's going to be about our negotiating style. We're going to have to develop a British approach, and we are, of course, in the process of developing a British approach to the negotiation of trade agreements. But I think, in fact, much more important are the thousands and thousands of dialogues that we're going to build up with policymakers, regulators, financial market supervisors in the jurisdictions that matter to us around the world, where what we're going to be trying to do is to shape their approach to the evolution of regulation, to shape the way they think about liberalization if we're dealing with the emerging economies and developing countries. And their tone is really going to matter. Of course, it's going to be a question of UK's great strengths. One of our great strengths is that we do have a long tradition of smart regulation. We also need to develop the ability to talk honestly about areas where we've got things wrong and what we've learned, because it's those kind of dialogues with our regulatory counterparts around the world that will ultimately be the way in which we shape agendas and we shape outcomes over the years ahead. I think there's one other communications challenge which is important, which is how we talk to ourselves about global Britain. And we haven't actually said anything about that yet, but I think we tend to talk about global Britain as something that we do out there with other people. But actually, to my mind, the one big missing piece of the global Britain agenda, and it's now starting to emerge in a slightly ad hoc way, is how we talk to ourselves about what it means to be a global country. Fundamentally, that doesn't involve talking with anyone outside the UK. What it means is talking to ourselves about what our approach to imports are going to be. Imports are ultimately our capabilities when it comes to building our export base or our knowledge economy, whether that's the import of goods or ideas or people, or the people who have ideas in their heads. And we have only just, I think, entered the foothills of having a discussion about what the UK's global supply chains look like, how the UK feeds itself, where the UK pulls intermediate goods in from, and that, of course, relates to things like food standards. And until we truly understand and we have a better picture of what the UK's global supply chains look like, it's very difficult to then make a lot of important decisions about where we should set the UK global tariff, or how much money we should be putting against innovation in the customs system, or what our migration system should look like. So I think there's a whole range of, I mean, I'm slightly stretching the communication question, but I think there's a really important point here, which is it's not just about how we talk to the rest of the world, it's about the discussion we have in our own politics about the way the UK is going to function as an economy dependent on the rest of the world for goods, services, ideas, because that's what global Britain ultimately means to me.
That's a really interesting point. Can I put that point to you, Professor Walmsley? The question both about how we should be communicating externally, but really interestingly, how we should communicate internally, and have this debate about what global Britain really means within the UK.
Mm. Yeah, well, for us, I suppose that concept really stems around ideas and people. We're not dealing with commodities, as it were, but we are dealing with how you bring the best qualified and most able people to the country, and how we exchange them around the world. And I think that I take Stephen's point that there's an internal message there, that it's about building opportunities for people in the UK, but part of that is going to be connecting them to others around the world to share perspectives, because it's that crucible where you get the best ideas. And that will also require the dialogues that Greg talked about around, and Stephen talked about, around not regulations and liberalization in this case, but really around what are the multilateral networks that you really need for influence. Part of that, I think, is people come to the UK, they work here for a while, they go back out to the countries they came from, or perhaps elsewhere, and build on that connection. I think over a long period of time, especially if they're taking leading ideas and bringing leading ideas here, that's the place in which we can build a long-term influence.
Georgie, can I put the same question to you? In terms of the how of government, which is something we think about a lot in terms of the Institute, how should government go about having this conversation?
I mean, it's a really difficult one, and it's not something that's just cropped up over the past 4 years. I mean, I think, we're talking about effective communication. One of the things that the government's going to have to get right also is obviously explaining where it has delivered on its vision and promise, but also when it has not been able to deliver on its vision and promise. Because unless the government kind of takes hold of that narrative and promotes a kind of conversation around that, others will do it for it. So I think we need to be very clear on our priorities and what we'd like to achieve, but also what we haven't been able to achieve through our trade agreements or broader foreign policy discussions that we're having within international organisations. And I mean, just to pick up on some of the other things that were said, when we're thinking about new partnerships with allies across the world, then I think we need to be thinking about fair partnerships. So rather than, approaching the country and saying, this is what we'd like to do, are you in or out, really kind of identifying joint priorities and then developing a plan for action together. And that can be as ambitious as we want. I mean, we have a new incoming US administration, possibly, obviously with the election taking place in November, whether President Trump is re-elected or whether we have a Biden president, we need to have an agenda towards the US. We need to know what our priorities are and come to them with a clear sense of what we'd like to achieve. And then finally, coming back to tone, I mean, tone matters hugely here in the UK, being clear on what government's trying to achieve, but also striking the right tone abroad, being aware, the Minister said, being aware of what priorities other countries have, where international organisations are going, what are the big stumbling blocks, what constructive role could the UK play? And I think, communication is going to be key. And if that's one of the opportunities for Brexit, I really hope that's the one that we'll see come forward first, in having a government that is really able to tackle that foreign policy debate in an inclusive but also constructive manner.
I'd like to give you, Minister, a chance to come back on some of those really interesting points, and just tell us what the government has in mind in terms of facilitating, particularly the point that Stephen was making about this internal conversation about within the UK about what Global Britain should mean.
Yeah, well, I think you're right in terms of the domestic communication. Where is Britain heading on the international stage? I think is incredibly important for us to make sure that we maintain domestic support, and particularly so the vision that I think the Prime Minister has of where Global Britain is heading, which is being open to the world, connectivity, influence. Broadly speaking, our liberal values going forward. That is exactly the thing which we need to get across domestically across the UK in all nations and all regions. I think in terms of a few of the other points, I think Georgina's points of being aware of others' priorities and building partnerships, absolutely. The UK is not in the business of going around the world trying to dictate. We are looking to build a consensus, push people in the right direction, if you like, nudge countries, for want of a better term, which I know the IFG will enjoy. I think in terms of where we take trade policy, I think you can see where we set. Somebody mentioned, it might have been Stephen, the UK global tariff, which is something that we launched earlier this year, and I think was deserving of a bit more attention than it got, because the UK global tariff, was a trade liberalising thing, B, it's a trade greening, so we removed tariffs on a lot of green goods, and also simplified matters, so making sure that trade can be more easily understood and more easily digested. So I think that was something which I'm glad. So I think it was Stephen who raised the UK global tariff. So I think corruption, I think Georgina raised as well, which of course we haven't really spoken. It's not really an issue much discussed in the last year or two, but I think it's a massive influence on business, and the UK has got a really proud record dating all the way back from when I was first in Parliament with the Bribery Act. Under the previous Labour government. So I think there's a lot of good work there. David Cameron was very, very keen on taking action on corruption. One of the last things he did as Prime Minister was hold in Number 10 Downing Street a big anti-corruption summit. So I think the UK's front-footed effort on combating corruption in the world, I think that's, again, an area that we could be very proud of and take further. So I think all of these are great ideas. There's an old adage that not everything can be a priority because suddenly nothing becomes a priority. But there's no shortage of good messages and good ideas the UK is going to be taking around the world as part of Global Britain. And
I think that's a very good point. And another thing the Institute is always banging on about is the importance for government of prioritising. We've had a couple of questions come in from viewers about the local impact of Global Britain, and if I could just put these to you, Minister. One from Rebecca Nadin and one from Juan Onzola, who are asking how can the government make sure that Global Britain has a positive impact on socioeconomic conditions in the UK as a whole, and how can we ensure that the north of England and indeed all the regions of the UK, not just the south, feel that they have a voice when it comes to defining and understanding what Global Britain is going to be?
Yeah, well, that is a really good question. And I think if you look at our trade agenda, the levelling up agenda links in quite well to our trade agenda. The scoping assessment for a lot of our first round of trade deals actually shows that the nations and regions of the UK are benefiting more than London and the Southeast, which might be a little bit contrary to what some people might think. Actually, the US scoping analysis showed that actually London would be the region of the UK would still benefit, but would actually benefit less compared to others. In fact, Scotland benefited the most, followed by the Midlands, followed by the northeast of England. So using our trade agenda and actually showing that trade will particularly benefit other parts of the UK, I think that is going to be a key part of that agenda from our point of view at the Department for International Trade.
And can I put the question the same question to Professor Walmsley?
Yeah, I think there is a great opportunity for us to build not just global networks, but internal networks. And the notion that the sort of golden triangle institutions can play a bigger role in connecting and partnering with institutions elsewhere, I think is a really viable one. There are things that we are certainly, I think it is, for Imperial, for example, it's probably true to say that our reputation is greater in Southeast Asia than it is in the north of England. I think that's something that we need to pay attention to, because that allows us to provide opportunities for students and from that region, and indeed for companies that we may spin out or partner with in that part of the region, in that part of the country to benefit. So I think it's an opportunity for us to build internal UK networks to help with that part of the agenda.
Stephen, can I come back to you? A slightly different version of the same question, but you've got a lot of international experience of how other countries go about shaping their sort of agenda in terms of particularly trade, but also sort of more broadly in terms of foreign policy. Can you point to any really good examples of how countries have managed to sort of bring the country together, define its sort of external identity in this way?
Well, it's a really difficult thing to do. And actually, I think in many ways, the larger the market, and particularly if you're dealing, say, with jurisdictions like the US or the EU, where you have a federal level that is doing the negotiating and in many cases setting the priorities, and then quite a complex landscape, both politically and economically underneath that, it can be very difficult to craft a trade policy, well, I mean, an international economic commercial policy that's genuinely got the buy-in and the legitimacy of every level of the system. And you often see that in free trade agreements, where the toughest negotiations are in fact often the negotiations over your shoulder with the provincial level governments or the state level governments who are a layer down in terms of governance. And the UK actually needs to obviously anticipate that in its own trade and international economic policy. We haven't answered the question of how we're going to bring the devolved administrations into the process of making international economic policy or trade policy. So I think there are perennial challenges to making international economic policy when you've got those layers of government. And I don't think it's any coincidence then that some of the most consistent and often coherent actors in international trade policy are smaller jurisdictions, the Singapores, who are managing in some ways just a less messy stakeholder landscape. I think there are things we can identify as good. I think the Australians and the New Zealanders are quite good at managing their stakeholder management and their civil society dialogue. I think the EU does that, does that comparatively poorly in comparison. The Canadians and the Americans, I think, both have relatively sophisticated ways of bringing commercial interests into the process of building and mapping priorities for trade policy. So, we can definitely, and I mean, the EU, I think, is arguably fairly good at that as well, probably better on the business side than on civil society. So, I think there are certainly examples we can learn from. I don't think anybody does everything perfectly. I think that it's going to be a question of us working out what others do well, but then absolutely crucially, just remembering that, idiosyncrasy is the name of the game here. The UK is not like anywhere else, just like nowhere else is like the UK. And the solutions that we come up with are going to be solutions customized for the unique political economy of the UK. And, needless to say, in the last couple of months, and indeed the last 4 years, we've learned something really important about the political economy of the UK, which is that leaving the EU is going to really force us to confront how we manage things like international trade policy across the 4 component parts of the UK. And we are only at the start of working out how to do that.
Can I get back to you, Minister, and just ask on that specific point that Stephen Adams has made there? What are the sort of structures and processes that the Department for International Trade is putting in place to make sure that it's fully informed about these different sort of views from different stakeholders and can build those into its thinking?
Yeah, well, thanks. I mean, on various levels, that has been a key part of the development of the Department for International Trade in the last 12 months has been developing our stakeholder engagement. Let me just take the devolved administration separately, first of all. We have to be very careful. Trade policy is a reserve matter for the UK government, but equally, large aspects of what happens to trade policy on the ground are in devolved matters. So agriculture being a very prominent one, but also in other areas as well, are essentially devolved in the UK. So we have to get that balance right between we are negotiating on behalf of the whole of the UK. It's a reserve matter, but equally our trade partners. It is in our national interest actually for all of the devolved administrations to feel comfortable with this, because not only do we have to act for their interests. So earlier this morning I was doing a fringe with the Scotch Whisky Association. Trade policy is a reserve matter, although obviously jobs and the Scotch whisky industry is obviously overwhelmingly based in Scotland. There's the Irish whisky industry in Northern Ireland, and then the UK negotiates on their behalf. But equally, we've got to make sure that the devolved administrations have got a say. We need to hear from businesses and consumers in the devolved administrations about what their priorities are. And our trade partners need to have confidence that whatever we agree will also be valid for the devolved administrations, which is also one of the reasons the UK Internal Markets Bill being there was not principally about trade, but it's also very important for others to be able to know that when they negotiate with the UK government, that we are negotiating fully on behalf of all 4 nations of the UK. So in that in mind, I've set up the Ministerial Forum for Trade. So quarterly, I meet with the relevant ministers in the 3 devolved administrations. I have regular meetings, I think just with Ivan McKee, the Scottish Trade Minister, I think 5 or 6 times since I rejoined the department in February, Baroness Morgan in Wales, Diane Dodds in Northern Ireland. We meet both as a 4 and bilaterally very, very often. I give them regular updates. I think in terms of broader stakeholders, we've set up our Strategic Trade Advisory Group, which is a relatively small group of real sort of trade experts. And then we have our different sectoral advisory groups as well, advising on particular aspects, whether it be technology, whether it be agriculture. And we also have the Trade and Agriculture Commission as well. So we've got a whole ecosystem, if you like, of consultation bodies and stakeholder groups as well, feeding in to the UK trade agenda. And that's exactly as it should be, because we need to hear. I mean, I think I was saying earlier that trade policy, you can get sort of lost in a whole world of jargon and negotiations and tariff rate quotas here for a bit of regulatory alignment there. And, if you don't hear from businesses and consumers as to what works for businesses exporting and what UK consumers want to have, then you could be lost in a theoretical world forever. We've got to work in trade is an immensely practical thing, or should be an immensely practical thing, to bring prosperity and benefit across all 4 nations of the UK.
You mentioned there the importance of other countries having confidence that the UK government speaks for the devolved nations when it's at the negotiating table, and of course you mentioned the Internal Markets Bill in that context. There's a slightly punchier question from Juan Anzola, who asks how the UK government can build confidence of other countries about the UK as a negotiating partner, given the approach that the government's decided to take with the Internal Markets Bill, where it has decided that some of the aspects of the withdrawal agreement that it entered into with the EU, it may need to disapply.
Well, look, I mean, the Internal Markets Bill is not a DIT piece of legislation, and I'm sure we've heard from Michael Gove and Alok Sharma, who lead on the Internal Markets Bill. The reason for that part of the UK Internal Markets Bill is hopefully something which will never happen. You know, we're hoping and confident of getting an agreement with the European Union. As Michael Gove has said, the need to have that aspect in the bill was driven in part by comments made by the European Union at the negotiating table in relation to goods and particularly food being able to pass from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. So let's hope that we never get to that point. And I personally remain an optimist that we will get a deal with the European Union, because I think it's strongly in both sides' interest to do that.
We've had a whole cluster of questions about specific different sort of trading relationships and blocks that the UK may or may not be interested in joining. So I don't know if I can draw you on.
Fire away, yeah.
So a question about the extent to which we might want to work with the Commonwealth as a bloc. A question about whether the UK should enter into some kind of union with Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. To create a sort of alternative centre of gravity, and also one about sort of what the objectives might be. Is there a way of working with others to tilt Africa away from China? So could you comment on some of those sort of propositions?
Well, thank you. And I think there's a lot in all those questions. I think on the Commonwealth, I don't think the Commonwealth really lends itself well to a Commonwealth free trade agreement. I mean, that's been my view the last 4 years. You're talking about a set of countries at very, very different stages of development. I think the Commonwealth, we did do a very successful Commonwealth Trade Ministers meeting a couple of years ago, and that was a good forum for discussing and improving the overall free trade agenda. I'm not convinced that the Commonwealth is really set up to be a trade agreement. Having said that, on Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK, CANZUK is often called. Look, that is what being done through the CPTPP. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand are all members of the CPTPP. We are hoping to join CPTPP with negotiations starting, I would expect, next year, amongst other countries. Japan is also a leading member of that. As well as important economies in Southeast Asia, like Vietnam, like Singapore, and also in Latin America, like Mexico, Peru, and Colombia. So that is an important trade agreement that I think CANZUK as such would be part of, would be covered by CP and TPP. And then I think the final part on Africa. Look, we have to recognize kind of some of our limitations. I think kind of in any way sort of seeking to replace China in Africa. I mean, let's be realistic here. I think what we do need to do is to make sure that we are of more influence in Africa. We have been opening embassies in Africa the last 10 years or so. When I've traveled in Africa quite a lot, partly in this job and independently, and I'm always struck by the diplomatic footprints. And when you come in from an airport and you'll see some huge new shining Chinese embassy building and others, and the UK has got to catch back up there in terms of where our diplomatic footprint is. Sometimes this will be working with partners. I do think we can work closely with some of our European partners. We can actually do a lot with countries like Turkey. I mean, Turkey's got, I think, the second largest diplomatic network in Africa. Istanbul as an airport is incredibly well connected to Africa. Turkey's got real capabilities in infrastructure building. I think the UK can partner with Turkey in terms of what we're doing in Africa on infrastructure. I use that as one example of something where actually we can then evolve an offer which could actually present an alternative consortium to what China might be offering. The UK might not be able might not be able to offer everything, but with a combination of, say, UK export finance, UK project management capability, and other capabilities put in by other countries, then I think there's a halfway decent chance the UK will be able to win some of those big infrastructure contracts. And then just, are continuing to spend 0.7% of GNI on international development, I think will make sure that our Africa footprint remains strong. We just need to tilt it a little bit more into raising prosperity in Africa, and trade, I think, will be a big part of that.
Thank you. Professor Walsby, can I come back to you? Do you think that, particularly on that Africa point, that research collaboration can be an important aspect of how the UK builds its sort of its weight within Africa, and maybe helps sort of counteract the Chinese influence there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the links that are being built and will continue to be built in providing enhanced scientific and knowledge capability are clearly going to be ways in which we can drive influence there. And I think in the long term, those will be extremely valuable, as valuable, I would posit, as infrastructure investments. But those will take time. I think the things that the UK is already in a good position there. The work that Wellcome Trust supports, for example, in its global health programs is important. I think the work that we have now through the Global Challenges Research Fund helps to establish those links in a really important and valuable way. So absolutely, those are going to be something a strength that we can build on.
Thank you. Stephen, can I come back to you just on the earlier questions that I was asking the Minister about sort of different trading blocks and priorities for the UK in terms of where it ought to be? Because as the Minister rightly said earlier on, we can't prioritise everything. What are the collaborations that the UK ought to be prioritising?
Well, I mean, I think a very practical answer is that the first thing you've got to focus on is continuity. And that means focusing on areas where UK exporters are currently benefiting from preferential access and rolling that over for the UK outside of the EU. So the EU deal is a version of that. Korea, Japan, Canada, Switzerland, Turkey, which is of course a particularly knotty problem because of its relationship to the EU agreement. So that needs to be the priority. I think then beyond that, the reality is that if we're talking about free trade agreements, most of the benefits for the UK are going to be at the margin. And that doesn't mean these deals are not worth pursuing, but we need to weigh, of course, we need to weigh that relatively marginal benefit for the UK economy against the opportunity cost of focusing on other things. So, I mean, my sense is that actually the main thing we have to do is we have to focus on areas where we get the maximum trickle-down benefits. And those will chiefly come, I think, in the areas of regulatory diplomacy. So the work that we do shaping the way the FSB works on financial services regulation, the work we do at the ISO, shaping the future of key areas of technology regulation, whether it's the regulation of cross-border payment systems or the protocols for driverless cars or the way AI is regulated, you name it. I think there's a potential big multiplier effect of high quality UK engagement on those kinds of commercial questions, potentially impact that goes beyond the kind of slightly more narrow impacts of trade agreements with countries a long way away. So, I mean, I think, but as I said, I also think that the real UK priority needs to be to understand better what our own global supply chains look like. We have only the most rudimentary sense of what we mean when we say the UK is embedded in global supply chains for goods, services, and people. And we can't really make intelligent policy, including unilateral policy, like the setting of the UK global tariff, or understanding why it is the West Midlands benefits from a free trade agreement. I mean, we have an intuition about the answers, but until we really know what it means to say the UK is a globalized economy better than we do now, it will be hard to make policy well. So I would make that a priority. I think that understanding ourselves as a globalized country, statistically, politically, is actually a real priority.
And that seems like a very good call on which to end this event. My very great thanks to all our panelists for participating, and thanks to you all for listening. Thanks again to Imperial College and to Wellcome Trust for kindly supporting our event today. And thank you, as I said, for joining us. You could, if you want to watch the event again or recommend it to anyone else, it will be available on the Institute's website and podcast feed. And please do join us for our next event, which is at 12:30, and that's on harnessing technology, transforming services. How can the government make the most of the digital revolution?